how did all of these Western governments simultaneously decide to commit suicide? Why would we, out of nowhere, import lots of people we're probably going to have to pay for, who aren't part of our culture and ultimately make demands in our society? Why would we all do this? What is it? Every Western liberal democracy just kind of flipped a switch, and all of a sudden, this is the solution to our problems. It seems really curious, and why would anyone engage in this as a nation? And I think the answer is there's actually a reason for this. It's not some weird conclusion everybody came to. And yes, cheap labor is part of it. That's the first thing we all go to. But actually, there's a much more important part of it, which is the sovereignty that we're discussing today. I didn't intend this, but I actually ended up writing a companion piece to Mark's remarks when it comes to immigration, the welfare state, and how this interacts and affects your sovereignty. So he gave you the practical facts and figures, and I'll give you all the nonsense theory behind it, hopefully. So always and everywhere, power seeks to expand its reach and centralize its control. This expansion of power has never been arrested by any kind of abstract principle or words on paper. It's only ever checked by the existence of opposing powers. These opposing powers have to be deeply rooted. They have to have an independent reliance, and they need to have the ability to demand loyalty. They must project spheres of influence in areas that are difficult for the state to replicate, and provide a form of sovereignty that can resist the power of government without having to engage in physical conflict. Communities with robust histories and traditions provide these opposing spheres of sovereignty. The religion and folkways of these communities are established by generation after generation, practicing them as if they are simply part of the rhythms of life. The beliefs are transcendent, delivering authority from forces that no earthly power can produce. These communities build institutions to perpetuate their way of life and care for the well-being of their members. Churches, schools, libraries, civic organizations, unions, and fraternal organizations pass down the values of the community. They preserve its culture, and they aid members who require assistance. Robust communities create an opposing sphere of sovereignty because they can make competing demands on its members. The organizations inside the community provide critical services that the state can't, and provide a level of emotional and spiritual well-being that the government can't reproduce itself. It also requires a set of behaviors that are particular to that community. And if the members intend to stay in good standing, these are behaviors that the state cannot easily alter. The loyalty of the members is necessarily split between the community and the government, which prevents the state from expanding its reach. The way of life in the community is deeply ingrained through hundreds, if not thousands of years of custom and habit. And the state is required to respect these because if it doesn't, it'll meet serious resistance. The inhabitants of virtuous and well-organized communities that exist over hundreds of years tend to accumulate wealth over time. That's a benefit of being established over generations and maintaining virtuous habits. They have the extra capital and leisure time necessary to build robust institutions which can provide critical services and act as a safety net for their members. These are the kulaks, the middle class that have moved on from base subsistence to independence. This is not some hyper-individualistic idea that we now call self-reliance in the modern world, but it's more of a form of community reliance that allows its members stability. Those who are part of the community don't have to live in fear of their day-to-day needs being met, but they're also not reliant on government services when things go wrong. So their loyalty belongs to the community first, and the government has to destroy that if it wants to expand its power. In his book On Power, the political theorist Bertrand de Juvenal describes the classic strategy of high and low versus the middle. The ruling class seeks to expand and centralize its power, but the middle class stands in the way. The lower classes rarely pose a threat because they're dependent and disorganized. They don't have the excess capital or leisure time necessary to marshal political opposition. It's the middle class with their private property, institutions, and wealth who can adhere to the long-standing traditions while withstanding pressure from the state. In order to gain more power, the ruling class must find a way to dissolve all opposing spheres of sovereignty, including those that are built by middle-class communities. To achieve this goal, the ruling class has to ally itself with a lower, dependent class that can be used to unseat the entrenched kulaks. Sometimes it's the domestic class, but this is really less than ideal because they tend to possess some of the same folkways and traditions as the middle class. You really need to see a big clash between the lower and middle class, a real sense of class envy before you can actually use the domestic low class. Instead, bringing in foreign underclasses is far more reliable because they have zero connection to the land or its traditions and are more willing to turn against those that are already residing there. Mass immigration provides cheap labor, which tends to benefit an upper class that can afford nannies and gardeners, but also, very importantly, it provides a large body of new voters to whom promises can be made. The diversity of the immigrant class means that it doesn't have a cohesive culture or traditions that can resist the will of the state. They don't have the roots necessary to build resilient institutions that can help them when they're in need. They don't have the leisure time or the will to organize effective political opposition. The lower immigrant class is dependent on the ruling class for their ability to enter the country, get work, achieve civil rights, and obtain access to the franchise. They often don't speak the language and tend to require a level of state welfare. It's not just that the immigrant class is not motivated to expose the expansion of the state, they actually actively require the growth of the state in order to succeed. In order to provide these services to its new political allies, the ruling class, well, they pillage the middle class. The kulaks are blamed for the inequality that now exists within society and are guilted or even compelled into giving up some of what they have in order to provide for the new immigrant class. This transfer of wealth from the middle class to the new dependent class helps the rulers secure power over the immigrants, but it also helps to weaken the kulaks, who are a natural barrier to the expansion of the state. As they become poorer, the kulaks lose the private property and leisure time that allowed them to build these resilient institutions. Their day-to-day existence becomes more unstable, and they're more likely to themselves end up dependent on state services. Mass immigration also erodes the well-being of established cultures, which provided a barrier to the state. People in the community with deeply held traditions limit what the government can command of them. But diverse groups with no unifying culture, well, they don't have any kind of resistance like that. As their native communities are forced to regularly interact with new arrivals, their shared identities begin to erode. It's considered taboo to separate yourself from the newcomers or maintain your original separate culture. The community institutions that once transmitted that culture and helped, they now start to close. The charities are exploited, the common areas are defiled, and those who maintain them see no reason to continue the effort because they don't recognize the people who they are now sharing the country with. They see very little in common. The ruling class makes it first taboo and then illegal for the communities to relocate and reform. Anyone who attempts to retreat from the consequences of mass immigration and reconstitute their old way of life becomes an anathema. The kulaks are no longer allowed to reside in communities where they live in virtuous patterns of their ancestors or transmit those traditions through institutions. The virtue quickly starts to fade. The opposing spheres of sovereignty are destroyed, and everyone becomes a rootless dependent who's now just at the mercy of the state, and the state now has a blank check for whatever it would like to do with its power. And this is why when we're talking about sovereignty, we have to talk about removing mass immigration, because mass immigration became a priority for the West across all liberal democracies for a reason. It's a strategy that not only removes the barriers to expanding state power, but it actually creates a patronage machine that demands and fuels that expansion. If we want an elite class in the United States that is ultimately responsive to the needs of the population, well, first we have to cut off the access of our ruling class to alternative populations. We can't give them the ability to simply replace the middle class at will and hollow out the only resistance that naturally exists to state power. Then, and only then, can we actually hope to cage the Leviathan that our ruling class has created.